disputes brought to one's attention, avenging kinsmen and familial relations. So you could boast about being a very good public speaker or being very wise in how you handle disputes. Somebody else might say, well, you never avenged your brother's death, so that was a no. In which case you would have to respond. That would be an insult to which you'd have to respond. Sexual or gender irregularity. This is only appears as an insult, so you never boast about your irregularities. So this can include things like effeminacy in men, performing female functions. Interestingly, that's largely related to dairy production. So, like, oh, you go and milk the cows in the morning, or you make the skyr or whatever. Castration, bestiality, sexual irresponsibility, incest, preference for sex over battle. So Sjolf gets insulted frequently because he would rather go hang with the ladies than go to war. And then passive homosexuality. So these get into a dangerous territory. These kind of insults almost always result in violence, because they enter the realm of what's called nith in the Old Norse concept, which is an insult that has a legal or a physical consequence. So you can sue somebody for this kind of insult, or you can fight them, and you're under less obligation to have avoided the conflict. The last one is sort of, you can insult their appearance or make a boast about your own appearance. I'm so beautiful. And like in so many societies, beauty here is equated with goodness. So the more beautiful, more attractive you are, the better a person you are. Insulting somebody else for how ugly they are. Egil gets this all the time because he has according to the saga, he has a very deformed head. So people are constantly insulting him for how ugly he is. You could also comment on, there's certain taboo eating habits. So mostly it's poop here. They talk about people eat shit, basically. And so you can insult somebody for being a shit eater. And that's one of those are sort of the typical categories. Skarthethan's insult of Thorkel covers many of these categories. This is from Burnt Njal's saga. I am called Skarphethan, and you have no cause to mock me, an innocent man, with your insults. I, at least, have never threatened my own father's life, as you have, nor have I ever fought with another, as you did with your father. You have rarely ridden to the Althing, or worked on lawsuits, and it must be easier for you to milk cows than to sit here by the Oxara River in isolation. You should clean the sausage from your teeth that you sucked out of a mare's ass before you came here. Your shepherd saw it and was appalled at such disgusting behavior. So we have covered here social duties a couple of times, sexual irregularity, and an alimentary taboo, which I think I might have spelled tattoo at least once in here. Sorry. So you've insulted each other, you've had the drinking, so how do we conclude this? Typically it ends peacefully, and that's sort of the goal, but it can end in violence. In Burnt Njal's saga, Skarthethan then proclaimed, "And now, Thorkel, foul-mouth, sheath your sword and sit down, or I shall drive my axe into your head and cleave your skull from your shoulders." Thorkel sheathed his sword and sat down promptly. It was the only time, either before or after, that such a thing had ever happened to him. He was shocked, I tell you. So silence or failure to respond to a claim can indicate that you concede the match. So Cass has said to me, "Gunhild, you don't even make shoes." And at which point I'm like, fair point. And I'm out. Or I could be like, I do too, and now I'm going to go learn how to do that. But really it's, and then you, so that's the sort of my favorite activity that shows up in the sagas is this debate. And I really wish we were all here in person. We could try practicing together. So practice at home, and the next time I see you, we'll try this. Storytelling. Icelandic people are particularly well known for their storytelling prowess. Bear in mind, though, that it's Icelanders writing down the fact that they were particularly well known for their storytelling prowess. So we're back to that unreliable narrator. Outside the formal role of the scope or scalds, visitors could be called upon to tell stories of their exploits. This shows up in one of the short stories where the Icelander Thorstein says to the king Haraldr, and stays with the king and tells the story of the king's time in Byzantium, which he, Thorstein, claims to have heard in yearly installments from Halldor Snorrason, one of the king's companions. So back in Iceland, he'd heard this story in yearly installments, and now he's in the king's court, and he tells the story as he remembers it. They can discuss the living or dead, distant ancestors, mythical beings, as well as standard saga fodder of family drama. So in my head, I just saw Theory's comment. In my head, the Icelandic saga in many ways was sort of the soap opera of the time. So you could go to Norway, where presumably they are less drama prone, and tell these Icelandic sagas, and the Norwegians were probably just like, what the fuck? So anyway, those are your options. Storytelling. Prophesying. I'm going to skip over actually a lot of the information in this section, just because, well, mostly because we got half an hour left, and I'm on page 18 of, again, 39. So I encourage you to go read this. It gets into sort of the role of the vulva or the volar. Volar is the plural. Vulva is the singular. I have not found a way to pronounce that. Does not end up sounding like an anatomical term. So if you've got a concept, let me know. And the síðukonur, or síðukona, they're women largely involved in this process. They're giving prophecy either in a formal setting where they've been invited to the feast to make a prophecy, or in an informal setting where they just happen to be in attendance at the feast and they catch somebody on the side and they make a prophecy. So that carries on for quite a few pages. There's a lot of debate about it. We are again basing this almost exclusively on written sources, and the written sources were written well after the practice had fallen into obscurity, so we don't know for sure how accurate all of it is. So yeah, that goes on for a bit. Skalds, we talked about storytelling. There's a guy writing recently, Seth Lehrer. He's a very good scholar. He knows what he's talking about, who makes the argument that the office, especially in England, of scop didn't exist by the time that we're really post-conversion England. That the scop had fallen away as an office. He makes good points, but it makes me sad to think that. So I do note that there's a couple of canons enacted under King Edgar and the Law of the Northumbrian Priests that both of those date to either the early 11th or late 10th century that do use the term scop, though in both cases it's aluscop, which is an ale poet. So either somebody who proclaims poetry at a drinking feast, or somebody who proclaims poetry when drunk. It's a little unclear in the translation. So they do, the term at least survives into the 11th century. Whether the office survived, I'm going to choose to believe it did, but I acknowledge that the evidence is not great. The Skald is the Old Norse equivalent of this job. We've got better evidence for that, mostly because a lot of skaldic poetry, well, for what it is, a lot of skaldic poetry survives. It follows very specific forms. Some of them are very complex, and to think about the fact that people were creating this poetry on the fly in some cases is very impressive, and would have taken quite a lot of training and knowledge of the forms and of the subject. Most skalds are men, but there are some examples of women proclaiming skaldic poetry. There's a whole book on it, in fact, that I encourage you to take a look at. It's Old Norse Women's Poetry, I think is the title of it. It's good stuff. Poetry of both the scop and the skald is often associated with the lyre. So we've got examples, bridges largely, or other elements of the Germanic lyre, Old English word is harpa, have been found in graves in Sweden, Norway, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and England. It's a stringed instrument that Cass has made one of because she's that cool. It could be plucked or strummed. English finds appear to be pre-conversion, so 6th and 7th century. Beowulf, Seamus Heaney's translation, Skop huilam sang hadoran herrota, thar was helelath dream, Duguth unlutul dena onwerda, and the minstrel sang, filling Heorot with his head-clearing voice, gladdening the great rally of Geats and Danes. And there's more Seamus Heaney translation there, but we're going to skip because time. Riddles. So we've talked about poetry, we've talked about storytelling, we've talked about boasting. Let's talk about riddles. Riddles are great. I will now read you one of my favorites. We don't... Touching my mouth again. This is one from the Exeter book. I am a wondrous creature for women in expectation, a service for neighbors. I harm none of the citizens, except my slayer alone. My stem is erect. I stand up in bed. Harry somewhat down below. A very comely peasant's daughter dares sometimes, proud maiden, that she grips me, attacks me in my redness, plunders my head, confines me to a stronghold, feels my encounter directly. Woman with braided hair, wet be that eye. So, anybody want to guess what that one is? It's an onion. That's one of one of my favorite poems. So there's a good question about whether or not we've got the Exeter book riddles. So we're pretty sure riddling survives in the Anglo-Saxon context. Whether or not it survived in the Old Norse context is a little trickier. There are some examples of riddles. And I like to think that, so the Norse have this obsession with cunning and cleverness. So I would argue that at least to some extent that means riddling probably existed. Like that's a good sign of, right? Like that's an indication of cunning or cleverness. There are some examples. Hervarar Saga has Gustum Blindi telling a series of more than 30 riddles. Another one, Thjallar Jon Saga, contains a single riddle, but it's believed to be 14th century, so, take it or leave it. I think they probably did tell riddles to some extent. The Anglo-Saxon tradition, obviously, much clearer. I like riddles. I think they're fun. Another one of my favorites is about the 500. A creature came where many men sat at council with wise hearts. It had one eye, its ears were two, it had 2 feet and 1,200 heads, a back and a belly and 2 hands, arms and shoulders, 1 neck and 2 sides. Say what I am called. And it's a one-eyed seller of garlic. And it's really fun the part of what makes it kind of fun is that it has its roots in an obscure Latin riddle book, the Enigmata, written in the 4th or 5th century by a Roman. So this riddle about a one-eyed seller of garlic survives all the way. And that there is a theory that maybe the reason that the the English kept the riddling tradition is that they had a stronger tie to this Roman tradition. So basically, it was not an indigenous Germanic practice; it was a Roman practice that the English adopted, and then later the Norse adopted, which is fair, I guess. So next is a mock court, which appears in 2 sagas in Iceland, and basically it was you'd all get together, you'd get drunk, and then you'd try people for various offenses. And it's a little unclear on how that maybe differs from the man evening or something else, but it's basically you're following sort of the rules of the thing, and you're trying somebody for doing something ridiculous. It may have included a certain amount of mockery of women in the Leostfit in that saga. It comes to Thorkel's attention that the women found the verdicts against them difficult to accept, since they could neither defend themselves properly nor have things their own way. So, men and women are involved in this, but women aren't getting to defend themselves, maybe. So that is the mock court, and then you have tabletop games. I can't pronounce it. Naftafel. Anyway. Viking chess. So you had that board game. Dice finds suggest dice games or gambling. we don't have they do talk about gambling in the sagas. We don't have a lot of evidence for what forms beyond, I think that guy'll win, I think that guy'll win, throw your money in. Beyond that, what kind of gambling was taking place. So that's games and entertainment. We're going to get into gift giving next. Talk a little bit about gift giving and the problems of gift giving. And then wrap it up with some etiquette stuff and talk a little bit about women. Anybody got questions? I got 3 people watching. I don't know where the third person... I don't know who the third person is. Hello, third person. But Theory, Cass, either of you questions? All right. Nobody's typing. So gift giving is an interesting part of all of this because, coming from Alaska, I think all of us, except for the third person, I don't know who they are. All of us have lived in Alaska and are probably at least a little bit familiar with the concept of potlatch. So there's an interesting connection in my mind between a potlatch and a Norse feast. It's a large hall, you're coming, you're celebrating together, and the gift giving. So in potlatch, my memory is that the host of the event gives gifts to everybody who attends. In this case, gift giving largely was the provenance of the host, but attendees could also give gifts. So it was an important way to bolster the relationship between a lord and his retainers. Sagas, poems are full of the concept of the ring giver. So you fought in battle for this person, and then they take the spoils of war and they portion them out. Judith is my favorite example. At the end of Judith, they bring all of the rings and everything to her, and she distributes them to the host, taking that role. So in this case, you might have your war band. You're the lord of the area. You hold your feast, and at your feast, you distribute gifts to people. So a term used in Old Norse to describe powerful secular leaders was vinsalar, which means that they were somebody with many friends. Having these friends that you've built these relationships with comes in very handy. Gifts are a great way to solidify friendships. My birthday's in November. A handout talks a little bit about how, which I didn't realize until quite a bit later was a Maori word. But it's this concept that there's a certain magical power that becomes associated with a gift. So if you get a gift of great value, so somebody gives me this mug, which is a lovely mug. I like it very much. So somebody gives me this mug. Now they've given me something, and the balance is in their favor because, now I need to return that gift to equal the balance. So I might give them this piece of soapstone, which is a less good gift. It's got carvings on it, but it's a less good gift than this beautiful mug. So, that's a gift, but I haven't equalized the magic of the gift. I haven't gotten rid of it by giving them something of equal value. And there's this notion that you could sort of punish people almost by giving them too great a gift. So if I give you, this was well organized. I should have had stuff handy. If I give you my Kleenex in this time of toilet paper shortage, and you give me back this pencil, then that is not an equal gift. And then now, I've placed this sort of hold. So in the sagas, it's important that all the gifts are repaid, either with equal or better value, or by service. So you can give a gift, or you can repay with a service, or repay service with a gift. Occasionally, it's developed into competitions who could provide the gift that was of greater value. Cass is going to be very familiar with that, and her largesse bag of magic. And you didn't want to end up with an imbalance because, so there's an anthropological concept called the poison of the gift. which a pure gift given without return kind of places the recipient in debt, and that dependent status is the poison. So you don't want to push this buildup of gift giving to a point where now you've left somebody unable to respond, because now you've poisoned the gifts, you've poisoned the friendship. It's uncomfortable. So it's this interesting balance in the sagas between, you want to give good gifts, but those gifts have to be respondable, and they have to be so like you couldn't give me like your homestead, because then what do I do? I'm like, there's no way to politely decline, but there's no way to politely accept. Failure to accept or receive a gift could also lead to violence, as it could be interpreted as a antagonistic slight against the giver. So there's this great concept of the debt inflicting strategy of gift giving, which is basically what we've just been talking about. In Morkinskinna, in one of the short stories in Morkinskinna, this is where this is from. So he put on the table before him, and it was a pig made of gilded silver. When the king looked at the pig, he said, "You are such an accomplished craftsman that I have hardly ever seen such better workmanship." It was passed around the men, and the king said he would grant him reconciliation. "You're a good man to send on dangerous missions. As far as I can see, you are strong and undaunted." At this point, the pig circulated back to the king. He picked it up and took an even closer look at the handiwork, and he saw that there were teats on the pig, and that it was a sow. He realized he had been made a mockery of, and threw it down and said, "Go up to the devil, up and kill him." So don't put yourself in that position where the king is calling for your head. Types of gifts: clothing, land, nicknames, which is an interesting example, shows up in Burnt Niall's saga. Weapons show up all the time: rings, chainmail, helmets. Also fostering, so you could somebody gives you a fine gift and you could offer to foster their son, or alternatively you take a child to foster and the parent gives you a gift as thanks. In Anglo-Saxon poetry, rings especially take on this very special status as an honored commodity. Lords are often described as givers of rings, and such generosity is very important to being a good lord. So ring honor, ringwerfung, ring thegu, it's a ring taking or acceptance of rings. Beag gifa, a ring giver. Beag gifu, a ring gift. Beag sel, the ring hall. So that kind of gives you an idea of the importance, especially of rings, in at least the poetic expression of society. So that it's even, the hall is the ring hall, because that's where rings are given. So gift giving, super important. Hanging with your bros, key element of Germanic warrior society was that connection between the comitatus and their leader. The comitatus is the Latin term Yacith, shows up in Old English. Jacintha in Gothic. There's another Antrostiones is the Latin term that shows up in Frankish concepts. Leith in Old Danish. Drot in Old Norse. Heimthegi in Old Danish. Huskarler. A couple of others. Yacith in Old Saxon. And basically this is the relationship that you're binding with the gifts. So you have the Lord, he gives the rings, he gives the recognition, he hosts the feasts, and his retainers, his comitatus, show up and attend. Strong connection between the members of the warband, and then between the warband and their leader. You want those strong connections when you go to war. It means everybody can trust each other. You know how people are going to react. All that kind of good stuff. There's a poem, a couple of poetic sites here, which I was going to read aloud, but there's a lot of them.